Hi, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. My name is Oniara, and I talk everything self-mastery, personal development, and just everyday life experiences and how I take the lessons that I learned from those experiences to live a more fulfilling and purposeful life. Today, I want to talk about boundaries and how to set them and how to maintain them. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about setting the boundaries, it's about maintaining and reinforcing these boundaries in our lives. And we'll start with what are boundaries? And boundaries are limits or rules that we set for ourselves or others in our relationships. And I believe that these boundaries, we set them in our relationships so that we can show up better. How do we set these boundaries? By trial and error and really reflecting on our relationships and how we can show up better. What rules do we have to set so that we can show up better? Why set boundaries? Boundaries are important so that we don't overextend ourselves, so that we don't do things that we don't want to do because we believe that we have to. Boundaries are important so that we can show up better. And I'll give you an example. Boundaries can be set in any relationship in your life, in a physical way, in an emotional way, in a spiritual way, at work, in your personal relationship with friends, with your romantic partner. And these boundaries, like I said, is for you to show up better in these relationships. And for me, I'll share one of the boundaries I've learned to set with my family has been with time, because I have a lot of time, and they believe that because I have a lot of time, then they can just call me an hour before what they need and I'm just going to be available. And that was bothering me, and that was like pissing me the fuck off when they would do that. It felt like they were disrespecting my time. It felt like they didn't value my time. It felt like they didn't value what I did. And I had to start setting the boundary of, if you want something or need a favor from me, you need to tell me with time so that I can plan accordingly and I can let you know if I am available for that with time. I don't want you to be calling me an hour or 2 hours before, because that doesn't make me feel like you value my time and I value my time. First, this wasn't easy, because at first I used to feel guilty for saying no to my mom, for saying no to her because she gives me so much. And yeah, I do have the time, and sometimes I just didn't want to do those things. And so I felt like if I did say yes, then I will have to go through the guilt of saying yes to something that I didn't want to do. And so I started reflecting on that, and I'm like, I'm feeling guilt anyway. Like, if I say no, I feel guilty for saying no. If I say yes, I'm feeling guilty for saying yes because I didn't want to do that. And so I was like, I need to start choosing the type of guilt that I'm going to process, and which guilt is going to, once I'm processing, it's going to help me show up better. And sometimes you do have to be selfish to be able to help others, to be able to impact the world. Because at the end of the day, the biggest impact that we have is in who we are and how we show up. And it's important that when we do things, we do them from our heart, because we want to, because we would love to do this, because it comes from love to do this. And not from fear, where it's like, I have to do this because I owe this to this person, or I have to do this because they do so much for me, or I have to do this. Again, coming from that fear factor, I have to do this so that when maybe I need them, they can be there. That's coming from that fear of not trusting that whenever you're going to need anything, it's always going to be provided for, right? And that's just something else. So coming back to setting the boundaries, it wasn't easy for me to say, hey, I don't want you to call me 30 minutes, an hour before you need this favor. I want you to tell me a day before. I want you to tell me as soon as you know that you need this. And if I can, then I will. And this wasn't something that I just did once or twice. This was something that was repetitive. Like kids, you need to repeat things. You need to repeat things so that they can understand. It's the same thing when you're reprogramming yourself and when you're reprogramming the relationships around you and how you want to show up and how you want to be treated in those relationships. So these boundaries need to be reinforced. It's like people need to get to know you again. It's like, oh, but you've always been this person. You've always allowed me to do this. Yeah, but not anymore. And that has to be reinforced. And that has to be again, maintained. Because it's one thing to set a boundary, and then it's another thing to continuously maintain it every time the situation shows up, because these people are used to something else. And maybe it's easier to set these boundaries once you, like I said, you get trial and error and you start getting to know yourself and what works for you best in relationships. You start setting these boundaries as soon as you know people. But for the people that you've already known, the people that are already in your life, and they've known a version of you that now is completely different, you're going to have the repetitive habit of saying, hey, this is my boundary, remember. And I believe maintaining and reaffirming the boundary is the most important part in setting boundaries. And like I said, this can be anywhere, not just in family, but also in your work relationships. When you're at work and you don't want to get distracted and you start setting that habit, like let's say at work, from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m., you're the person that is focused at work, no distractions. That means no calls, no emails answered, no messages, no meetings, no anything at this time. When you start setting this habit, people already start recognizing, oh wait, Oniara is the person that cannot be bothered from 10 a.m. to 12 because they have that time. And so they're not going to be paying attention to their phone. They're not going to be answering my messages. They're not going to be answering my calls. They're not going to pick up a random meeting because this is their time for this. Because you've set that habit. That's a boundary, right? No distractions boundary, right? For example. And how do you maintain that boundary? How do you teach people how to maintain that boundary? Reinforcing that boundary and you maintaining that boundary. And because a lot of the times we think, or like, oh, people are just breaking my boundaries. And it's just that you broke your own boundary. You didn't stick to your own boundary. You allowed people to break the boundary. You have to be clear. This is my boundary. And if it's broken, these are the consequences. Remembering that when we're setting boundaries, one of the things that keeps us from setting those boundaries might be the bad feelings that might come from saying no, or from saying, this is how I'm going to show up and this is how I want this relationship to go or to show up or whatever. Sometimes what keeps us from expressing these boundaries is how we are going to feel or how others are going to feel. And what we need to understand is that we are going to have to process our emotions no matter what we choose. And if we choose the best option for us, then we get to show up better. And when we show up better, we have more impact in the world. So like I said, for example, sometimes, right, when I have to say no to my mom, I have to either process the guilt of saying no and feeling bad about saying no, or process the guilt of saying yes to something that I didn't want to do, and then going to do it, and then the whole time that I'm doing it, I'm just like, oh my God, this is so annoying. Why did I say yes? I knew that I didn't want to do this. Like, why, when I was the one that chose to be there. I was the one that broke my own boundary and said yes. And so it's about maintaining those boundaries and then choosing, hey, I'm going to have to process an emotion. I'm going to have to process guilt. I'm going to have to process whatever emotion. No matter what I choose, I'm going to have to process. And so then might as well choose something that is best for me. Because when I choose what's best for me, I show up better. And when I show up better in my relationships get better. And at the end of the day, the quality of your life is the quality of your relationships. So when you do things for yourself, when you're selfish about how you feel, when you're selfish about taking care of yourself, then you show up better in these relationships, and then these relationships only get better because you're taking care of yourself and you're not resentful with the other person because you're not taking care of yourself or because they're making you do stuff that you don't want to do. They're not making you do anything. At the end of the day, you're choosing. We're always choosing. And so it's choosing what are you going to process. So I'll leave you at that. In conclusion, boundaries are limits or rules that we set for ourselves and others in our relationships. Why are boundaries important and how do we set them? Boundaries are important because it is how we get to show up better in our relationships. And when we show up better in our relationships, we empower each other to be our better selves and grow to be more of our potential. The quality of our lives is the quality of our relationships. That's why we want better and deeper relationships. That's why these boundaries are important. Because we show up better in these relationships. How do we set these boundaries? Getting to know ourselves, reflecting on what works for us to show up better, to be our best selves. Remembering to do things from our heart, from love, and not from fear, not from thinking that we owe anything to anybody or that we need to do this to get something back, but from love because I want to do this. I don't need anything back. How do we maintain them? We set these boundaries, and then the most important work is maintaining them and reinforcing them in our lives and in those relationships. And it's extremely important that we ourselves are following these boundaries once we set them and not allowing them to be broken, and then being clear in our relationships about the consequences of these boundaries being broken and what will happen if these boundaries are broken. And just remembering that when we are making choices and when we're choosing in our lives, we're always going to have to process an emotion. So we are always choosing what we are choosing to process. And my invitation is I invite you to always choose what comes from your heart, what comes from love, to connect back to yourself and guide yourself, what comes from here and not from fear. I hope this helped you in some way, shape, or form. And thank you for watching all the way till here. I hope you're having a magical day wherever you are, whatever time it is. Remember to share, comment, or subscribe. And I'll see you soon.